Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled FIFRA, ESA, and Pesticide Consultation, Identifying and Overcoming the Complexities from a Grower's Perspective. I'm Chris Boomsma, CEO here at the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, or CAST, and it's my privilege to get this kicked off today before I hand it over to our moderator and speakers. Just a few things then before we get started. First of all, a little bit about CAST, which is a 501c membership-supported nonprofit organization. We were formed in 1972 and happy to celebrate our 50th anniversary in 2002. We are proudly nonpartisan, apolitical, unbiased, and remain science-based. Our membership includes both organizations and individuals, the mix of which you can see on the screen at this time. Our mission is to convene and coordinate networks of experts to assemble, interpret, and communicate credible, unbiased, science-based information to policymakers, the media, the private sector, and the public. And we envision a world where decision-making related to agriculture, food, and natural resources is based on credible information developed through science, through reason, and through consensus building. As I said before, we do a lot of our work through the support of membership organizations, and some of those members are represented on our boards. We do have 65 board members representing scientific societies, companies, nonprofits, and universities, 200 active task force members working on CAS reports, and a variety of volunteer scientific experts. So lots of volunteers, and we are certainly thankful for each and every one of them who contribute so much to our organization. So that's a little bit about CAST, the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. At this time, I'm going to hand it over to Tony Bird of Syngenta, who you've probably seen before if you've been here for the other essays and webinars in this series. So we are on essay webinar number 5. And we're going to hand it over now to Tony. Tony, welcome back. We're happy to be here for our 5th one. And take it away when you're ready.
And thanks, Chris, for the introduction. And as Chris mentioned, this is the 5th in our series of webinars. I thank everyone who's been able to join the prior webinars. This one is associated or basically looking at identifying and overcoming the complexities from a grower's perspective. The authors for this current paper are Mike Ertz, who serves as Vice President for Science and Reg Affairs for Florida Fruit and Veg Association, Dr. David Epstein, who served as a Vice President for Scientific Affairs at Northwest Horticultural Council and worked for USDA OPMP. And our speaker today is Dr. Mike Willett, who has a PhD from Washington State University in horticulture. For 2 decades, he was a president for Scientific Affairs for Northwest Horticultural Council, a trade association representing the tree fruit industry of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, working on a broad range of federal and international policy and technical issues. Mike is currently working on a range of issues, including a project with Northwest Nursery Improvement Institute to streamline the international movement of tree fruit germplasm and cultivars, and the development of a mechanistic air blast sprayer model to improve regulatory decision-making. So, Mike, I appreciate your time today, and at that point, I will turn it over to you for your presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tony. Because we have so little time, why don't I just get into it? And again, I also want to express my thanks for everybody taking the time to join us today. I think it's important to know that growers really understand the importance of engaging with pesticide regulatory action agencies, and particularly in 1996 with the implementation of the Food Quality Protection Act, that need to interact with regulatory agencies really stepped up. And then a decade or over a decade ago, when it was clear that there was going to have to be pesticide consultations done on hundreds of pesticides across the country, it was realized by grower groups that communication was going to have to occur with organizations such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service. Could I have the next slide, please? A number of organizations, including the EPA and the National Research Council, have identified issues and possible ways to improve consultation processes. In the paper that Mike Ertz and Dave Epstein and I put together, we've identified some ways too. Today, we're just going to focus on a subset of those, about 5 different areas. We're going to focus on mapping, pesticide use and pesticide monitoring data, drift reduction technology issues, modeling in general, and then just touch briefly on the bulletin lives too and some suggestions we have for improving it. Could I have the next slide, please? Stanley Culpepper, who's on the call and can take questions about this, provided me with this slide to look at what the impact might be of threatened and endangered species listings in Georgia. In 11 counties, habitat for 2 threatened and endangered salamanders has been identified. And how to actually parse what the impact might be, or how to ensure that the impact was really targeted to those areas near the habitat, was really an important issue for growers there. Can we have the next slide, please? I think the take-home message from this is that the University of Georgia, Stanley's lab, and in cooperation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, put together a project to actually identify habitat for these salamander species. And if you look at what a worst case scenario would be, to say that all land in a county where the salamanders are reported could be subject to mitigation measures versus a historical habitat, which really substantially reduced the acreage that would have to be considered, would be considered salamander habitat, versus the survey that was done where it reduced that habitat area to less than 0.5% of the land. So it's this kind of focus in terms of determining the maps or the location of habitat that is extremely important to growers, to avoid having to do mitigation measures that aren't necessary because the threatened and endangered species doesn't exist in the areas adjacent to those farm fields. Could we have the next slide, please? Because I'm live in Washington State, in Yakima, Washington, and I have a lot more experience with these issues in the Pacific Northwest, thought we'd take a look at some of the same issues in Washington State. This is an agricultural land use map of the state of Washington, produced by the Washington State Department of Agriculture. It's extremely comprehensive and ground truthed, and the red areas you see represent orchards. And I think that you'll notice one thing is that those orchards, those red areas, are really located in the narrow river valleys of the Columbia River and its tributaries. So with the exception that there's a little bit of orchard out in the Columbia Basin, which was made possible by the Columbia Basin Project, which is irrigated about 500,000 acres out of Grand Coulee Dam in the very center of the state. This is where about 70 to 80% of all the fresh apples, pears, and cherries that are sold in the United States or consumed in the United States come from. And so because of the proximity to these river areas and to these river valleys, the issue of endangered species has been top of mind for a lot of growers. We have the next slide, please. Let's just use one example. This is an example that was one of the first 17 species listed in the EPA Story Map project. It's a species of brassica, a plant that grows on the very vertical cliff faces called white bluffs. The species is white bluffs bladderpod. And you can, in the middle image there on the slide, you can see the white bluffs very clear. When you take and overlay that map with the habitat, the crosshatched habitat of the white bluffs bladderpod, and put it up against cropland, agricultural cropland in the southern part of the Columbia Basin Project, and this is just across the river from the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, you can see that it does abut, if not directly overlapping, agricultural land. And while I don't know that there's been any particular impact of this listing, given the pesticides that growers in these areas use, I do think it's really important to consider what the potential economic impact might be. So could we have the next slide, please? The agricultural land that most closely abutted that bladderpod habitat was a cherry orchard at the southern end of its habitat. And I think I thought maybe it might be worthwhile to talk about what the economic impact might be. If you're a cherry or apple grower in the Pacific Northwest, it's very likely that you could be planting that orchard on some sort of support system, a trellis of some sort, whether a vertical or a V trellis. And because growers are increasingly planting orchards at higher density using size controlling rootstocks, which are not self-supporting. And so the trellises are necessary to keep the trees up and maintain high productivity in those orchards. So a study done at Oregon State University estimated that agricultural land with irrigation rights in the Columbia Basin was probably worth somewhere around $15,000 an acre. I mean, that's not too far off what good agricultural land might be in other parts of the country, including the Midwest. However, when you add in the cost of putting in all the trees and add in the cost of the trellis, that establishment cost of the first 3 years is about $50,000 an acre. So right now you're up to over $60,000 an acre in investment. And if you add any kind of protection over the top for rain or sun protection, then that cost could even go higher. And so, while clearly this is a worst case scenario. Not all orchards would have had this level of investment, but it's increasingly common to have that level of investment. And so extremely important to make sure that the maps are accurate. Could we have the next slide, please? What I thought would be useful now would be to take a look at the an adjacent valley. This is the lower Yakima Valley. The Yakima River flows through it. At the bottom, it's sort of a bluish purple line you can see. And the definitely purple, aqua, and green lines that you can see above it are irrigation canals on the slope up to the top of the Rattlesnake Ridge. Those irrigation canals are not salmonid habitat, but the Yakima River and most of the tributaries in the region are key salmonid habitat and have been for eons. So there was initially big concern that irrigation canals would be considered salmonid habitat, but they aren't, because all of these irrigation districts have fish exclusion devices at their intakes to prevent salmon from getting into the system. However, there are other bodies of water associated with irrigation systems that have been known to, where it's been known you could find salmon. Could we have the next slide, please? If you look at the central image here, this is an image from the EPA Salmon Mapper website. And the red line shows, according to this website, salmon habitat. At the bottom is the Yakima River, definitely salmon habitat. And but the red line going directly, in this case, to the north, is what's referred to as an agricultural drain. This is a sulfur wasteway or sulfur drain. And I was surprised to see this the other day as I was putting this presentation together, because it was my understanding that these drains all had salmonid exclusion devices near their mouth so that they no longer entertained populations of salmon in those areas. And therefore couldn't not be considered salmon habitat. So I called the manager of the Rosa Irrigation District, which manages this irrigation district in the Yakima Valley, and he sent me a couple of pictures. The picture on the right, right where the red arrow is, you'll see a little white bar at the very top of the picture. And if you look way over to the left on this slide, that white bar is this device right here. And this device is a fish exclusion device. It operates under the principle that the very shallow water in front of that dam-like structure prevents fish from getting enough momentum to actually clear the structure. So in this particular case, this drain extends for about 8 miles up through the agricultural areas of the Yakima Valley, and is designated as salmon habitat all the way up to that entire 8 miles, but it very likely is not salmon habitat. And so in this case, this map probably needs to be adjusted. Perhaps there's some reason why the salmonid exclusion device wasn't noted, but in this case, the irrigation district, now that they're alerted, they're going to take what action they think they need to take. And because they're very interested in making sure that they're doing the right thing in terms of protecting the species that are in the rivers nearby their irrigation project. Could we have the next slide, please? Let's talk a little bit about data and information. There's a lot of information that's submitted by grower groups and by states related to pesticide use data and pesticide concentrations in water. In fact, the state of Washington has an extremely robust monitoring program, probably not the only state that does. In fact, the state of Washington has tried really hard to develop a sampling program that met EPA requirements so that could be submitted and used as actual measurements of how much of what the residues of certain pesticides were in water adjacent in the agricultural areas. However, oftentimes that data is not being used because of questions about the frequency of sampling and other questions about whether it's really representative of the residues that actually end up in water. Although clearly I think the department's done everything it can to do to try to ensure that those numbers are representative. Also, grower groups spend a lot of time collecting use data from their members and providing it back to the EPA and then hopefully back to the services as well. And if you looked at the carbaryl risk biop that was just produced, it's clear that that data is probably not valued for any number of reasons. And I appreciate the National Fisheries Service for going through those reasons. And instead, they primarily rely, except in California, which has a mandatory data collection period, they use a database from Kinetic that really is not publicly available. That data is not publicly available. So it's really hard to ground truth it from the standpoint of grower organizations. I guess the whole point is not to disparage in any of that, except to say that if there is really a shortage of personnel to do this kind of work at the agencies and the services, wouldn't it be better to come up with some kind of protocol that could be developed that if people collected data, whether it was use data or residue data, that it could be used in these risk assessments, both for endangered species as well as for the general pesticide registration. Go ahead, next slide, please. This is a slide that Stanley Culpepper gave to me, and it raises the question why in row crops, growers can't be given credit for using drift mitigation technology to reduce the sizes of buffer zones. And there are some drift mitigation technologies like hooded sprayers and hooded nozzles and other things that have been shown to substantially reduce drift and have been considered by the agency, I know in the past, as drift reduction technologies that could be put on the label. Could we have the next slide? But I want to tell you that in orchard and vineyard crops, where growers primarily use air blast sprayers like the one on the top left, there are no drift mitigation technologies that growers can use that would allow them to perhaps reduce the size of buffer zones adjacent to orchards if there were offsite movement concerns for any reason. Yet there are a lot of people, both growers and university folks and manufacturers, that are trying to get growers to adopt and encourage precision orchard sprayer, vineyard sprayer technologies. And they would like to be able to say that it offers you an opportunity to treat in areas that might be of concern for offsite movement, because these technologies have been shown to reduce drift and reduce offsite movement. There is, however, again, just like we were recently just talking about, there is no clear protocol for getting that done, although I understand there are initiatives underway through the work being done at NC State and around the country to come up with at least protocols for presenting to the agencies to try to get mitigation credit for this precision orchard sprayer technologies, vineyard sprayer technologies. Can we have the next slide, please? Just one quick point. I noticed as I was looking at the herbicide strategy for runoff mitigation and the point system applied to different practices in orchards in arid areas of the West, one of the practices that was given the highest number of points was contour farming with strips. Unfortunately, in years of experience, unless the slope is almost de minimis, contour farming is extremely challenging for issues related to the plant and issues related to the movement of equipment. This picture showing you a slope in a really productive agricultural area just south of the city of Yakima shows you how growers normally plant orchards. They're not planted on the contours. So if you needed those kind of points to be able to use a certain herbicide or any other ground applied material, most growers would never qualify for that because of the way they have to plant their orchards. Can we have the next slide, please? You know, let's talk a little bit about modeling. In the 70s and 80s, scientists introduced to growers the concept of timing insecticide treatments primarily using temperature-based modeling. And of course, growers are pretty skeptical as to how that could actually work. And so various ways were developed to verify the accuracy of these models. This is the slide that the graph on the slide here is one way that it was done. The 0 line represents the actual date of the event the growers are trying to time their spray to coincide with. In this case, it's egg hatch of codling moth, which is the worm in the apple in the western United States. The old calendar system, which was 3 weeks after full bloom, is the blue bars, and you can see there's a lot of variance in days between what the real timing was they were trying to hit and when the calendar spray system actually told them they should spray. However, the black bars show what the model is, when the model is telling them to spray, and there's only a couple days variance off the actual event. And so this kind of information showed growers that they could trust using the degree day models, the temperature-based models, to time sprays for codling moth. We have the next slide, please. This is important in terms of modeling, in terms of the question of how much is enough validation. Let's look a little bit at some data from the chlorpyrifos risk assessment, which has been going on for a very long time. And what you're looking at is pictures of the Hood River Valley in northern Oregon, just adjacent to the Columbia River. It's where most of the pears are grown in Oregon, and is one of the highest density pear production areas in the entire world. The picture on the left is Neal Creek. It's intensively sampled for pesticides, and it was actually where the highest levels of chlorpyrifos were detected. Can we have the next slide, please? This is information showing that the concentration estimates that were made in the most recent completed work by EPA, their estimates were that 0.72 to 0.59 parts per million would be found in the water. However, the highest value, when as much as, I don't know, almost 60% of the acres were treated with chlorpyrifos, were only 0.42 parts per billion. And then as the use declined, the actual level of detections declined as well. So it matched pretty closely. But the numbers used for determining risk to threatened endangered species was not the monitoring data. It was this modeling data. And primarily it was modeling data generated by using a model called AgDrift for orchard air blast sprayers. Can we have the next slide, please? The problem is with orchard air blast sprayers, there's only a screening level model available, a tier 1 model that assumes that every orchard treated, no matter what it is a sparse, dormant orchard, young apple trees without leaves on them, which is obviously a worst case scenario for drift. There's no higher resolution model for orchard air blast sprayers. So we can't really make a comparison as to what a higher resolution model at this moment would tell you. However, what we can do is look at work that was done in the adjacent valley in northern Oregon, where pesticide malathion was applied to cherry trees with a helicopter. In aerial application, they have screening level models, tier 1, and they have higher level mechanistic models, tier 3, that allow more control over the inputs. And what the research that was done showed that was when you compared the output of the model to the actual measurement of malathion residues in adjacent water bodies, what you saw was that the tier 1 screening level model overpredicted by 40 to 50 times. However, when you use the tier 3 model, that overprediction was only 1 to 2x. And so because there is no screening level model for orchard air blast sprayers. We think there should be. And in fact, over the last 7 or 8 years, a group of us have gone out, talked to grower groups, and those grower groups have committed over $500,000, almost $500,000, to collecting data to make this model work in conjunction and conversations with the EPA. However, we probably need another $1 million more. So, maybe at the end of the talk, I'll put my phone number up. Any of you on the call can just Venmo me whatever you can spare to try to get us closer to that $1 million goal. But it's hard to ask growers to come up with 2 times more money when we can't actually guarantee them that this model is going to be used for estimating offsite movement yet. And so we've been trying to find public sources to help support some of this work, and it's been really hard. Seems like that it's important to be accurate, and it would seem like it would be important to the agencies and to the services to find ways to help produce a little more accuracy in those estimates. Could we have the next slide, please? So finally, we're just going to touch briefly on Bulletin Lives 2. Bulletin Lives 2 is a system to determine what mitigations you need to do if you're close to habitat of threatened endangered species, over and above what it actually says on the label. And I'm sure that's oversimplifying Bulletin Lives 2, and I apologize for that. But right now, it's not effective to use it on mobile devices, which are largely used in the field by people that have to make pesticide recommendations and by growers. Also, you can only search for one active ingredient, one pesticide product, not active ingredient, for a single application event. It would be so much better if you could add multiple products into that system, because then growers could say, okay, I'm going to make this application in this month, and I'm going to use these. Are there going to be any restrictions? It would save a lot of time for users. Also, the Minor Crop Farmer Alliance folks, which is a group of specialty crop producers around the United States, they suggested that Bulletin Lives 2 should offer a 9 to 12 month time interval before mandatory adoption of new restrictions. And of course, this new initiative that was just announced, I think last week, to find ways to better refine endangered species maps, obviously is going to help the accuracy of when people need to respond to potential threatened endangered species risks when they're about to make a pesticide application. So there you go. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it back over to Tony.
Great. Thank you, Mike, for a very comprehensive and good presentation. Just as a reminder to everybody on, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A. We will get to the questions as they start to come in. Mike, I'll also tell you that I've got my Venmo ready to send you a donation for this. I think it's very important. Or alternately, I could set up a GoFundMe page and we can try and get this thing done, Mike.
Yeah, we'll put Harold Thistle's picture on it.
Exactly. So we do have some questions already, and I'll actually just start going through the questions. And the first question, could be for Mike or Bernalyn as well too. It's a question from Bob Mann. It says, when we arrive at newly defined habitat, is that determination dynamic over time? In other words, how and when would maps change? In other words, how and when would maps change should the presence of endangered species and their habitat change?
I can address that, Tony. The FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force has for years looked at habitat change mapping from year to year as we collect data on species. And we have found that there is a change over time. Sometimes it's minor, sometimes it's major. I don't know that the agencies yet have built into their plan an update schedule, but it certainly would change over time and has the possibility of getting larger or smaller. So when you think about some of the mitigations that may be in place, I think that has to be kept in mind, because if an area gets smaller and growers, as Mike noted, have spent a lot of money to relocate or locate orchards, it could have a very high impact, just the change in habitat delineation over time.
Great. Thanks, Bernalyn.
I have a question for Mike. You showed some slides with the irrigation district distributions on them. I found those very interesting. And I think one thing we don't talk about, when you're in Western irrigated agriculture, who's really in charge of that water? What does the grower do when that water is delivered and when it's taken away from him?
Okay, well, the overall responsibility for water relies with the Bureau of Reclamation, but there are numerous irrigation districts that have been set up historically from somewhere around the late 1800s until the most recent irrigation districts were set up in the late 1940s or early 1950s. And all of those irrigation districts are managed by organizations that were set up by the users on those districts. And some of the folks who are here with us today know that there are two types of users on these irrigation districts. There are senior right users and there are junior water right users. And when you're short of water, the junior right water users get cut off. And so, but the water is delivered to the grower's site, usually on some sort of schedule or at some sort of volume, maximum volume, and then the growers use it, and then any water that flows through the system off that orchard would go into one of these agricultural drains. You know, having a conversation with the Rosa Irrigation District manager just last week, the amount of water going back into those drains is substantially less than it was as growers have, at least in the Yakima Valley and other parts of the inland Northwest, have changed their irrigation practices to using much more efficient irrigation systems, drip, micro, so that those drains are less important than, say, when a grower was using, or where growers use, for example, real irrigation, which tends to produce more runoff at the bottom end of the field.
Great, thanks, Mike. And Mike, I actually have a question as well too, with regards to just in general, the impacts, and I'll use Washington as an example, the impacts from endangered species to growers in the Washington area. You know, would you say it's very similar across, you know, if you just look at, say, orchards, is it similar across the entire state for orchards? As you start to look at berries and other crops, are there some sort of growers or commodities that would be, you know, extremely impacted for some of these regulations, or some less so? Just curious about that.
Yeah, I think Tony, and you know, again, I'm probably not the overall expert on these kinds of things, but although it's clear, as you saw with this White Bluffs bladderwort, there are endangered species that could have certain niche locations where growers would be impacted. But I think probably the biggest concern, and when people think about endangered species in the Northwest growers, it's been the juxtaposition of their farming operation to salmonid habitat. And so in those areas where there's likely more salmon habitat, which is, for example, in Washington, Northwest Washington, which has large river systems and adjacent to the Puget Sound, growers there are, you know, they think about this quite a bit. In our area, you know, adjacent to the river is important, but it depending on how these buffer lines are drawn, you know, may not have a big impact to someone farming a few hundred feet up the slope, as long as the irrigation districts and the drains aren't considered to be salmonid habitat, which, as we know, they aren't. So I think when this whole question of having to protect threatened and endangered species, particularly salmonids, a lot of people had their hair on fire because the definitions of what salmonid habitat was going to be were not clear. And I think it's a little clearer now, and probably there's a little bit less concern, but I don't think there's any less concern to try to make accurate decision making, regardless of why you're making the decisions because it can affect some percentage of the growers.
Right. Bernalyn, anything to add to that?
I think Mike brought up an interesting point and on the salmonids that made me think about how some of the activities in the Pacific Northwest have responded to state actions as opposed to federal actions when it comes to listed salmon? What kind of programs have already caused people to be more aware or to put in protective structures or buffers around their water areas?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, Tony, the irrigation districts have done a lot of work to make sure that salmon aren't getting into places that they probably aren't going to do very well in terms of spawning anyway, and to eliminate return flow issues and clean up water that's going back into the rivers. So, and they've spent millions of dollars doing that. And so that is one group of folks that have been impacted and have responded, I think.
Yeah. So we do have some more questions in the chat here. Actually, one is looking for more of a general, can you share the full reference for the Winchell 2018 paper on draft modeling? And maybe we could provide that information to Megan. It could be, or Carlos, it could be posted on the CAST website.
I haven't, Tony, I haven't seen the final version of the paper, but we did cite that reference in the paper that we wrote. So as soon as you get that, you'll be able to find the full reference for the
Okay, great. And this will be posted on the full paper, full presentation will be posted on CAST website, so you'll have access to that at that point. So another question. So it says, we've heard tension from growers on electronic labeling. Specifically, the acknowledgement that there needs to be a way to quickly update labels if new mitigations become available, but that in many parts of rural America, access to internet is either limited or non-existent. How might some of the ideas discussed today help to shape that conversation?
How about if we ask Stanley to weigh in on that question?
Yep, and we will see. Stanley, are you able? I know Stanley had a power outage at the
Hopefully
site.
you can hear me. Maybe we're not paying the bills. I'm not sure. But I have no power, so if I go out, I apologize. So, yeah, this one's actually dear to my heart. And there are obviously a lot of people engaged in, let's call it label reform. As a member of one of the committees at the Weed Science Society of America, we're working toward a uniform label structure, right? And the goal for label structure is let's get the label structure uniform across, for example, for us herbicides. But once we get that uniform, then that would lead into an electronic process that can do exactly what you're talking about. And yes, as a representative of many growers, that is exactly what we would like to have. But there certainly are challenges, right? There's no doubt. In Georgia, I'm really blessed. We actually just surveyed, I think, 1,800 growers. 92% of them have access to a cell phone. 88% of them have access to a computer. So a state like mine, I feel like with that, along with extension, we can communicate very well. Now, with that said, some of you are screaming. There are clearly some states that we have documented that don't have the electronic access yet, right? So that's something that we've got to work to overcome. But to me, we got to build the structure first. Ironically, build the structure of the process, but we have to build the structure of the label. And we want uniformity as weed scientists or as those communicating with farmers. We all want uniformity on labels. Imagine if you looked on herbicide label X or Z or G, and number 5 was always rotational restrictions, or number 3 was always use rate, whatever it is, but some type of consistency to build that platform that would help us move into the electronic age. I think we're all there, but obviously we've got a lot of work to do. There's certainly, I don't want to name groups because I'll forget somebody, but there are many other groups that are contributing to this. So I think you've identified something. And your last part of your question is, how does it tie into this? I think this is the perfect stage, right? Look at what ESA is doing to all of us, all ag stakeholders, all of us on the farm, every single one of them. So as we move forward, and we have to be able to communicate information more effectively, more efficiently, the process of doing that through the labeling process or the secondary websites, et cetera, is going to be key, right? So that label structure, moving the label structure through to go to electronic, to communicate, it all needs to move together. So that was a long-winded answer. I apologize, but I think it's highly important. A lot of people are engaged and working on that. I know we are at the Weed Science Society of America. We're really excited because so far we have not run across a single person that does not believe we need uniform structure, right? So that's hard to find everybody on the same team, but that's something that we're all on the same team, and hopefully we can accomplish that as we move forward. That builds into a sound electronic labeling process.
And I think, Stanley, to add to that, there has to be some provision for time and flexibility.
Absolutely.
Because what we've seen over the years is we talked about the habitat changing and some of the things that the growers may have already done that could change their ability to use or not to use a product. So I think flexibility is a key, as well as a consistent delivery. If those two are possible to marry, that's where we need to be, but it takes time.
It does, and I'll give you an example, Burnley, because Mike kind of started off with our salamander species in Georgia. And I think this is really cool because just 2 or 3 weeks ago, those 11 counties where we could not apply Enlist Duo for over 2 years, those 11 counties are now back on the most recent label, right? So that's exciting in itself, but we have to be able to communicate that, right? Because if we're not communicating the accomplishments, just like the challenges, right? But we do have a few accomplishments. We've got to have very, very rapid access to information that's coming out of our regulatory agencies. There's no doubt whatsoever, because the investment we make today on a per acre, I don't care if it's a per acre of cotton, per acre of tomatoes, it is tremendous. And the agricultural community right now is in a very, very difficult situation. So again, us as scientists, as regulators, as industry partners, man, we've really got to work together to do everything we can to help our family farms remain sustainable.
And Stanley, while you're on, just a follow-up question, as Mike mentioned in the presentation around the work that you did in Georgia for the salamander, and understanding how some of these mitigations are going to touch across many other states. How can we as industry, grower groups, everyone sort of come together in a quick way, if you will, to help, sort of what you did in Georgia, to help that across the rest of the country? What do you see as a platform? I know, we talk about these refined range maps. Will be an SOP coming out soon. What do you think, in your opinion, is the best way to sort of accomplish some of this work moving forward?
Well, I think I'm a relationship guy, right? So with our ESA pilot program, the reason it's been so successful is really the relationship with our fish and wildlife partners, the relationship with our growers, relationship with our Department of Agriculture, relationship with the US EPA, right? Everybody played a different role, but everybody was critical in success, right? So, I think you and I are on the same board. If you use science, you develop that hypothesis, you work together. It may or may not work out like you wish, but you will find a solution many times, at least throughout my career. So I think as the mapping approach, I think is a highlight of what we can do with each of the potential areas, right? I have 6 different areas I'm working in our ESA pilot program. Mapping of species was just one. That's the one we shared with so many people, but that's only one of 6 things that we're trying to do. And that one kind of shows how we can work with the regulatory agencies. We can bring fish in, and it's a wonderful relationship that we've got now with those guys, and them understanding agriculture and taking time to do field trips to visit farmers. I mean, it's a miracle in itself, but it's about building those relationships, helping the regulatory agencies understand, how much we cherish the land, how much we cherish our pocketbook. We only use tools that we have to use. We're obviously going to protect the environment. Who's the true environmentalist? It's the family farm, right? So I think it's the relationship and building the relationship, putting the right people together, and then generating the best science. And again, I'm not going to get what I want every single time. The data is not going to work out that way. The data is what it is, but most of the time, agriculture is not afraid of sound science. What agriculture is afraid of is the best available science when there really isn't any good science, right? And that's where we have to work together and overcome. Let's overcome that best available science that sometimes just isn't really good science.
Great. Thank you. Bernlin, did you have something to add?
That last statement made me think of some of the examples, Mike, that you gave, and one of them was the air blast sprayers and the improving technologies in that area. How do you think the pace of agricultural adoption of new technology has changed over the last 20 years. My question goes to how we used to think, I think of an agricultural setting being fairly static, but these days I don't think that's quite the same. I think technologies are being adapted because what other way is there to increase yields and make a profit without doing as much as you can with technology? So has the pace changed over the last 20 years? Is there more tendency toward new technology adoption as we move forward?
Well, I think that it's clear that there's been a wholesale adoption of new technology where it makes sense economically for growers to adopt that new technology. I mean, 20 years ago, you could drive through the state of Washington and almost never see orchards planted on a trellis. Now, if someone's planting an apple orchard, they're all planted on trellises because of the adoption of that technology, which is the highly dwarfing productive rootstocks that are resistant to certain types of diseases that makes sense to growers to use, and then everything else, all the other technologies that come along with it. And you know, there's a really high interest in adopting new technologies that of all sorts, as long as it makes, as I said, economic sense. I think the change in sprayer technology has been a little slower, although, you know, people are making these changes, but sprayers are pretty resilient pieces of equipment. And if there doesn't appear to be some other benefit to adopting these more precision technology applications, which also can be expensive, I think that growers are probably not going to make that move quite as quickly as they might, as if they saw there was other incentives available to making that change, because right now most of them have sprayers that work just fine.
Great, thank you. And just as a note, Paul Watling, thank you. Paul actually posted what I believe is the reference for Mike Winchell's paper from 2018. I'm not sure if the entire group can see it in the chat, but regardless, we can grab that and it'll post it anyway with the final paper. But it looks like it's Journal of Environmental Quality from 2018, January, issue 47. Just to Jessica, FYI, if you wanted to grab it quickly. So, Stanley, Bernalyn, any questions from your end on Mike's presentation? So we don't currently have anything else in the open questions.
I don't have any questions. I really like the way Mike explained things. It clarified for me some of the growers' perspective when the impact of a use of maybe a particular assessment or endpoint really does impact them on the ground. So it's very, very good making a connection with those dots, Mike.
And you know, I'll add what blew me away, that example of the salmon, you know, where you showed that it's not even in that area, but it's restricted. That what that does to me is that helps me connect the dots that unless you're out and about and you actually have your feet on the ground, there's a lot of things that are getting overlooked that could ultimately hurt our growers. So again, it goes back to building those relationships and making sure that you're making the right decision. So I thought that was fascinating and something I would have obviously never thought of for the state of Georgia. But there are probably tons of examples like that we haven't even begun to understand, and highlighting that, I thought that was really, really powerful. And I have never heard or seen anything like that in the presentation. So I certainly appreciated that. And I appreciate you and your colleagues and all the effort. Most people don't know, but these guys have been working on this for months. So we appreciate your help.
Yeah, and Stanley, just to kind of build on that, and this is more of a, I guess, question / comment to you and Mike as well too. You know, based on what you just said and some of the information, you know, to Mike and Stanley, how many growers, and not just growers, but just sort of local folks, you know, helping with farms and conservation, you know, water management, other things, are aware of these impacts of endangered species and what may need to be done? like that example you mentioned, Mike, that, oh, they weren't aware that they actually had this sort of blockade in place, but that's going to have significant impact, right? So how many folks are either aware or unaware of some of these things that are coming, and how can we get that information out there in sort of a timely manner to be used, right? I know, my friend Greg Watson always says that, there's a lot of conservation and things happening on the ground that growers are doing already, but they're not getting credit for, right? So how can we get that, into the system so that growers are getting a lot of credit for these things?
In the case of that irrigation drain, got the folks that manage the drain, the Rosa Irrigation District, were unaware that that drain was being considered as some honored habitat. And those people they're deeply involved in this discussion. And so even people that were deeply involved were not aware that that map was actually might put some of their growers' practices at jeopardy related to that classification of that particular drain. But I think more broadly, I think the question is when those kinds of things, in the case of the Rosa Irrigation District is going to make contact with whoever they need to. So that's not a problem, right? But when an average grower questions whether or not there's a map accuracy or some kind of assessment inaccuracy, how do they communicate that back to the appropriate folks? And I think that's obviously a huge challenge, not only for the grower who might question why something's classified in a certain way, but it's also a challenge for the folks that are doing the classification because, that feedback loop is always challenging.
Tony, what I would add is, I've actually been training Georgia growers. I'm starting basically my third year of training. So my guys are kind of up to date. I'm trying to position them. I'm trying to help them understand. Now, I realize that's a little unique, but I think over the last 8 months, if you look at extension, because I'm an extension guy, especially in the world of weed control, right? Herbicide strategy was certainly a powerful document that brought a lot of attention to potential impact. So I think we've seen personally in the circles that I'm in, especially with my extension colleagues across the country, I think we've seen a change as far as we're actually communicating better. We're getting some feedback, but we're still not doing a good enough job helping the grower or the person that's an actual applicator realize how important their thoughts are and how important people like me and my colleagues and you and your colleagues and everybody else that's on this call, how do we get more feedback from there, right? And I'll give you an example. We were blessed to have a conversation with 15 or 16 specialty crop growers, and I won't say names, but 2 important people at the US EPA. And the conversation that occurred for 2 hours, I had to shut it off at 2 hours, but the conversation that occurred at 2 hours, that going back and forth, talking it through, I just wish every grower had that opportunity to understand and to give feedback and to give input. So I personally think over the last 8 months to a year, we have made monumental progress. We have a long way to go, but we need to figure out how to foster, a better interaction with the people actually at the ground level. You and I and our colleagues, we're in the middle of this stuff, right? But carrying it down to the ground level, and I'll put a plug in for extension. If you're in a state that's got extension, you got a better opportunity. There's no doubt in my mind. But there are a lot of states now where extension doesn't have the connections that it once had. So a long way to go, but I think a lot of you need to pat yourself on the back because I do think, and the agencies involved, included as well. I think there's so much effort. We got a lot to do, but at least we're moving in the right direction, I feel personally.
Great. Thanks, Stanley. A couple comments here, and actually, so my friend Greg Watson, who I mentioned, is on the call. Greg, thank you. Just says, wanted to share identifying opportunities for high-resolution pesticide usage data to improve the efficiency of endangered species pesticide assessment. Stephen Eikenberry, lead author, has just become available online in the Science of the Total Environment. So, Greg, thank you for that. And then one other comment from, and apologize if I get the last name wrong, but Lindsay Zahel, regarding the salmon block, says, I would suggest revisiting the ESA definition of critical habitat.
Tony, I'd make one more comment, and when it comes to where the growers are in this equation and what makes FIFRA so different in interacting with the Endangered Species Act is that the end impact is not on the person who's taking the action of registering a pesticide label. Certainly it is on how they form their label and what they can do with it. But the impact on the ground and the implementation of the requirements for any protections is happening at the grower level. And the grower in this equation of registering a pesticide and consultation required under the Endangered Species Act has no formal role. So it is a very unique situation. It's a national action. It affects people from where Mike is in Washington to where Stan is in Georgia, all across the United States, and microcosms in each area of differences. So the complexity and the need for good communication and the need for clear instructions is ultimately a hard goal to reach when you have so many moving parts.
Thanks, Merlin. And parts have definitely started to move quicker since 73, right? So things are most definitely moving at this point now. So at this point, there are no further questions. So unless there are any final comments from Mike, Bernalin, or Stanley, I will hand it back to Chris.
Thanks, Tony. And thank you, Mike, in particular, for presenting today. And thank you, Stanley and Bernalin, for once again coming back and being part of our panel discussion. So with that, folks, we're going to wrap it up. Just a few quick comments for you. First of all, please note that we did release a paper in January on RNA interference in agriculture. You might want to check that out. Just scan that QR code on your screen at this time. You can download it. Otherwise, visit the CAST website. You can find it there under publications. We do have some upcoming events. First of all, we got an upcoming webinar on March 12th, which is related to FIFRA ESA, state regulatory agencies as conduit for informing local conditions in federal pesticide processes. Come back for the 6th event in this series. Also, we have another webinar coming out, but it's also a paper release, Preventing the Next Plant Invasion, Opportunities and Challenges. So that's a webinar release with NASMA. You can go to NASMA's website, or you can follow us on social media or visit our website, and you can find and register for that event. So we hope you can join us for that as well if you're interested. And then we have a paper rollout in St. Louis, Missouri on applications, benefits, and barriers of gene-edited crops. And more details on that can also be found, particularly through our social media pages. So with that, I just want to say that nominations are open for our Board Log Cast Communication Award. Note that the deadline has been extended. It's been extended because we are probably going to do the announcement a bit differently this year. A different date, different venue, and we didn't feel that we needed to close the application window so early. So scan the QR code on your screen at this time, and you can nominate someone, a deserving individual for this award. Who can be nominated? Folks who excel in promoting agriculture through various channels such as research, teaching, extension, or mass communication. Lastly, we hope you're interested in becoming a CAST member. If you like what you've seen and heard today, become a CAST member. We'd certainly appreciate it. It supports our organization and allows us to do what our nonprofit is designed to do. Fulfill the mission and the vision that I set out earlier in today's presentation. So with that, folks, I want to say thank you for joining today. Please come back for webinar number 6 in the series, and at which time we'll talk a little bit more about the rollout of the full paper at the Crop Life America and RISE conference in Arlington, Virginia in April. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.